Cachamaniacs.
GeoGearHeads.
Welcome to the 93rd installment of the GeoGearHeads. I'm the bad cop with Daryl W4, and we'll be joined shortly by our special guest in just a moment to talk about the history of podcasting.
I'm sure this is going to be a great conversation and give you some good background on the medium we all enjoy. And to make it easier for some people, we're excited to announce that the GeoGearHeads are now included in Stitcher radio service. That's basically another podcatcher type service, and it streams the audio to your smartphone or over the web. And their app is available for both Android and iOS, and you can look for that Stitcher On Demand app in either the Play Store or in the Apple App Store. And you can also follow the Stitcher link that we're going to drop in our show notes as well. Hopefully that will make it easier for you and your friends to catch the show every week.
That's a great addition because, now you can make your own podcasting radio station. Now, this week, we're proud to welcome Cash-Advance.com as our new sponsor of GeoGearHeads. So thank you to Lookout Lisa and the Cash Advance team for their financial support in bringing you this show. Check them out for your geocaching supply needs, including their satellite tracker decal, which is starting just under $8 US. This adhesive vinyl decal is an illustration of a satellite with its own geocaching.com tracking number in its body. They're a great addition to the rear window of your caching vehicle, and they can be really fun at geocaching events. Cash Advance is right now at the GeoCoinFest 2013 in Las Vegas. So if you're there, check out their booth and say hi to Lisa and thank her for supporting our shows. You'll find them at major events all over the country, online, or in their brand new retail store in Spokane, Washington. I've got to get out there myself and say hi to her in her new space. So hit up our show notes for that link to the satellite tracker decal, or head on over to cash-advance.com to see her full inventory. And thank you in advance for your purchase as a supporter of GeoGearHeads.
Yeah, I really wish I could get it out to GeoCoinFest this weekend, and I do love running around and grabbing all those trackables off the back of the car. And if you do hit the GeoCoinFest, we'd love to hear about your experiences, and you can email those to us at geogearheads@cachamaniacs.com, or call them into 206-350-3647 so we can drop that on the upcoming randomized show. Now that show's only 2 weeks out, recording on October 29th at 9:10 p.m. Eastern, that's 6:10 p.m. Pacific, and then we're back next week with our Getting Good Chord show. So call in your emails, comments, and even questions for that one as well.
Now, Daryl, that show is going to be October 24th. That's at 9:10 p.m. Eastern or 6:10 p.m. Pacific.
Yeah, and I said the 26th, didn't I?
29th, but that's okay.
29th? Oh, so I was way off.
I just wanted to correct that before we got too far along.
Yeah,
so,
thank you very much.
Hey, not a problem. Now, tonight, we're delighted to be joined by an observer and participant in podcasting since its very early days through his show, Podcast 411. Rob Walsh, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to the GeoGearHeads.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I'm really excited to get a chance to actually sit down and talk with someone else who's actually been in this a little longer than I have, and you've actually kind of turned this into a profession as well. So can you kind of give us a little bit of the background on your shows and what you're doing now?
Sure. I started podcasting, as I would say, late 2004. I slipped it in right under the wire, and my first podcast was called Podcast 411, and it was a podcast, and actually still doing it about once a month, podcast where I interview other podcasters, and I've had some pretty good guests over the years. Some big names people may know: Ronald Moore from Battlestar Galactica, Colin Ferguson from Eureka, Quincy Jones, even Senator John Edwards was on at one point. So I've had some interesting guests, and I've had a lot of people you may never have heard of, and then some podcasters I'm sure you have. Alex Rose from Dignation, and Leo Laporte and Adam Curry and a lot of the big name comedian podcasts from the early days, Keith and the Girl, and just anybody you can think of back in the early days of podcasting came on. It was a good fun show to do. That was my first show. My second show was called, at the time when I launched, called Today an iPhone, which was the first podcast about the iPhone that started in April 2007. And that is now called Today in iOS and covers everything there. And I've been doing that show every week since April of 2007. And that obviously became a bigger show, not so niche of an audience. And it's funny, most podcasters' second shows tend to be their bigger show.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, a couple of great shows. And I do remember a lot of that early stuff that, like Adam Curry. And I remember listening to the Edwards interview. So some great interviews there for anyone who is interested in podcasting and getting to check out some shows you might not have heard of too.
Yeah, I mean, some of those shows are still going on. Skepticality is still going strong. Keith and the Girl is still going strong. So some of those ones I did over 8 years ago, those shows are still podcasting. Many, not all, but many, and not even most, have pod faded. But there's still quite a few that I've interviewed that are still doing their shows, which is fun.
Excellent.
But then that Podcast 411 led me to my day job, which is working for Libsyn. So I have a great job, which is I get to talk to podcasters for a living. That's my job, and help them make money and help them with their podcasting, help bring them on board. So I get to work with some great podcasters because of that. Mark Maron, Aisha Tyler, Joe Rogan, some of the podcasters I get to work with on a regular basis.
Yeah, very cool, which is actually the service that we use for our shows as well. And that's how I've kind of found out that you were actually working for them, is from the Libsyn house podcast show. We call it The Feed.
Yeah, we actually started an internal podcast called The Feed, and we talk about Libsyn, and we talk about what's going on with the service, and then we talk about podcasting in general. So we try to do that about every other week, so it's twice a month, and then you've got Podcast 411. So about 3 times a month, I'm doing some sort of podcast talking about podcasting.
Sweet.
So if you're not a podcaster but think about it, those are 2 shows you should check out. They'll give you some good information about podcasting.
Well, speaking of the podcasting, that term seems to have kind of changed a little bit over the various years. And to me, it always seemed like it was supposed to be a media file delivered via RSS. But what has that really become in the current thinking about it?
I still think of podcasting as you need an RSS feed. There's a lot of people that say, oh, well, I've got my podcast, just go to my website. And all it is a link to a file. That's not really a podcast. I mean, definition of a podcast is it's something that's time shifted, but it still has to be subscribed to. You have to be able to subscribe to it. And if you don't have an RSS feed and you can't get into iTunes, I don't consider it a podcast. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be in iTunes, but if you can't submit to iTunes or any of the other aggregators out there where someone can subscribe to your show, it's really not a podcast. It might be, sometimes it's just streaming audio. What it definitely is not is live. So if the only time you make content available is when it happens, that is the opposite of podcasting. So that's the antithesis of podcasting. Now, you can still do a live show, record it, and make the recording available as a podcast, and a lot of podcasters do that. But I think the key part about podcasting is that someone can subscribe to your show, never have to visit your website, and get the latest episode when it becomes available. And I think that's, in my mind, is the definition of podcasting.
Sure, yeah, and it's got to be one of those, to me, that it's downloadable, not just streaming, because that makes a huge difference. If I can't download it to my device, the whole point of the podcasts were so that you could download it, time shift it, and do it without any kind of internet connection whatsoever.
Right. If you can't consume it when you're on an airplane in airplane mode, if you can't listen to a podcast when they tell you to turn all those devices off, then it's not a podcast.
Yeah, I think one of the good examples had been, if you can't listen to it when you're in the submarine exploring the Titanic, it's not a podcast.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing, is just making it available to people when they want it, where they want it, how they want it, and they don't have to have an internet connection to consume.
Definitely. Well, this is not something that just kind of popped up on the radar all of a sudden. It started even before the turn of millennium, but it wasn't until, about October of 2003 that it really started to coalesce. And there were some key people at, I think it was the BloggerCon convention, that really started working toward building the engine that would allow what is now podcasting.
Right, and I think the real culmination of when it really started to kick off was in the summer of 2004, late summer 2004, when the first few, when Adam Curry released, his podcatcher, and the first couple people started releasing RSS feeds that could be subscribed to. It was really hard to subscribe to a podcast early on. I mean, as hard as it was to make it, it was even sometimes harder to even consume it. People had to get an aggregator. The first real one was like iPod or X. They had to download the software. Then they had to remember to sync, and they had to connect a device, disconnect a device. It was difficult in the early days to consume a podcast. This was, good, almost 9-10 Apple supported it in iTunes.
Oh yeah, I remember using. I want to say I was using Juicer at first, which was just a terrible app as far as user friendliness goes. But all it would do is go and fetch the files and drop them into your iTunes. From there, you then had to sync that to your iPod or whatever, or you could just play them right out of iTunes. But it was nowhere near as easy, and there were so many points along that path where something could and usually would go wrong.
Yeah, that's why I say anyone podcasting before June 29th, 2005, before Apple supported podcasting, that is the first generation. That's the early adopters of podcasting, because they were doing it where it was just a wing and a prayer, hoping that someone would go and consume it. After that, it became much more popular. Now that Apple had gotten behind it and supported it, made it easy for people to consume. And then a lot more people came out of the woodwork. And you see there was a big uptick in new podcasters after July, starting July of 2005.
Sure, and I was doing the Michigan Cycling Podcast at that point, and I saw my listenership. It's been so long that I can't remember for sure, but I want to say it was almost a tenfold increase, within a week, just after iTunes was released.
Yeah, and a lot of people were caught off guard. Now, those that were hosting with Libsyn were lucky enough that they survived. There was a lot of people whose sites went down in those early days. I was lucky. I had my files on Libsyn already, because I had already felt the crush when I did my interview with John Edwards, and I moved to Libsyn just to survive that. But again, Libsyn helped a lot of those producers early on. Libsyn was the first podcast host, started in November of 2004.
Yeah, there were a couple of others that had popped up around that time, but I ended up going with Libsyn for that first one and have been there ever since. And unfortunately, a lot of those other guys have also come and gone, and with it, a lot of the shows had gone as well, because it's not easy to move your podcast once you're set up and using that one provider.
Oh, we'll help you. If you want to move to Libsyn, we can import all your files off your RSS feed. So we have tools to do that. Now,
yeah,
it's a little easier today than it was.
I was going to say, now it's a lot easier than it was back
ago.
then, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, let's go through some of the shows that are kind of relevant here. You mentioned already that you got your Podcast 411 show in just on the wire at December 31st of 2004. My first show was actually before I even started geocaching. I found out about geocaching kind of through my first show, which was Michigan Cycling Podcast, back in April of 2005. Now, it was June 29th of 2005 was the first of the geocaching podcasts, which was the CacheCast, and that was actually Pedantic of the unofficial Apple weblog. And we interviewed him on the original Cachemaniac show. So if anyone's interested in that, you can check that out. But he pod faded, I want to say within 6 or 7 months. The Podcaster show didn't start until July 10th of 2005. And that seemed to be a big year. There were some other ones that started up right about that same time, including the Slaga podcast, which again has pod faded in July again on the 30th. Geocaching podcast, which is another show that I'm involved with, was November 30th of 2006. And Cachemaniacs, the original series, launched January 1st of 2007. Then we added in the Cachers of the Round Table show on August of 2007. And Bad Cop, you started your show March 8th of 2010, the Caching in the Northwest. And that's still scheduled to come back, isn't it?
That is scheduled to come back. We've hit a couple of technical snags, but we're going to follow this format. So using Google Hangouts on Air, and because we're two guys with families, and it's hard to schedule a podcast, month after month. We need to move it to a weekly podcast. That's so much easier to schedule. And with busy families, we're going to do it at like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night when we know we're supposed to be home.
Which hopefully you will be. And then, of course, this show launched January 6th of 2012. So we're one of the younger podcasts in geocaching, of course. But we obviously love it.
We have that laser focus on.
We've done 93 episodes since then. That is laser focused. That's a lot of. So you're basically doing it weekly since then.
Yeah, exactly. We have done it exactly weekly since then. And it's a lot of fun, but it does turn out to be a little tough on some of those like holiday weekends and stuff. Now, I was a little curious what some of the first podcasts were that people had listened to, because I can't even really remember what my first ones were anymore. But S. Seegers had replied on Google Plus that his very first podcast that he downloaded was the Hometown Tales, which he said has since pod faded.
Yeah, Gene.
And also.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead.
I know Gene. I actually interviewed him on Podcast 411, so it was one of the ones I interviewed back in the day, and I knew Gene pretty well. And a really good show, and it would basically look at urban myths and legends around the country. So what was your hometown folklore? What was something that went on in your hometown? Somebody that supposedly died here or was killed there, or something that's strange that happened. So it was a really good show, and it was both audio, and then they did some video, and Gene did a really good job on that.
Yeah, I heard about that one. I wanted to go check it out, and found out that they'd either pod faded or packed up shop, according to what he was saying. And then his other one that he mentioned was Scott Sigler's Nocturnal, and that is another podcaster who really kind of changed the whole direction of podcasting and where it could go. I shouldn't say he changed necessarily the direction, but he expanded the realm for podcasting.
Yeah, Scott's the one I always point people to when I say, if you want to know how to promote your show, go see what Scott does. And I interviewed him a couple times on Podcast 411, and he was just such a consummate marketer of his content and his show, and it turned into book deals, and some major book deals. So Scott is very talented, but he's also one of the best marketers as far as promoting his own content I've ever met.
Nice. Now I got to go check this out. I have missed Nocturnal.
Yeah, I'm not really sure which his first one was, but I started listening to his first one that he had started doing as the Podio book, and at the time I was too involved with other shows and just never got into it enough to follow it, but he really did an awesome job with it. Even back then it was like, wow, because I want to say he was doing that first one entirely by himself, and he was doing the voices and everything, and it was a really engaging, wonderful show. Now, Bad Cop, what was your first podcast that you actually listened to, if you can remember?
It had to be a Leo Laporte podcast. And at that time, he wasn't. I think he was still calling them webcast, not necessarily podcast. But I remember, downloading from an RSS feed to be able to load onto this MP3 player that was like the size of a loaf of bread, if I remember, It seemed that way when I was carrying it about. And yeah, I could put 2-3 podcasts on that, and that's all that little MP3 player would hold.
Yeah, I remember that pretty well. How about you, Rob?
It would have been Daily Source Code with Adam Curry back in the day. I started listening, and I got into podcasting back in October of 2004, and I still remember that first article. It was on Engadget. It said, "Hey, about podcasting. If you want to get into podcasting, all you do is add this enclosure tag to your RSS feed." And I was like, "What? What's an RSS feed?" And then that's kind of got me interested in it, and I started digging into it. And it took me about 2 months to get the first podcast up. But yeah, Adam Curry, and I started listening to him and a bunch of other ones along the way.
So there was actually a couple of shows out on, I believe it was the West Coast. This is back in like 2002 and 3. Where they'd actually post on their website links to the audio versions of their shows. And this was like a syndicated radio show or something like that. They were like, one was on photography and the other was on tech subject of some type. So I was downloading those manually and essentially doing exactly this. And I was looking for something, every couple of months that might be able to automate this process for me. And that's how I came across podcasting. And at the time, Podcast Alley was the big directory, so I started poking around there and seeing what the interesting subjects were, and grabbed like one or two. And I couldn't even tell you what those first shows were, but it wasn't probably until probably about the time that you actually started doing your podcast 411 that I found out about Adam Curry's show and started listening to Daily Source Code. So I was kind of late into that. And it wasn't long after Adam Curry's show that I actually started podcasting on my own.
Man, Adam helped a lot of people get going in the day, and that was Adam was out there evangelizing podcasting and did a great job out.
Yeah, definitely, and he was kind of the motivation for a lot of people, even if he wasn't necessarily the technical reference. He's the one who got everyone excited about creating their own podcast. And when I did the Michigan Cycling Podcast, I think I was like number 1,900 and something that was entered into the podcast alley directory. And it's like, wow, there's already that many shows out there. And this has only been going for, I want to say it was like 6 months or something at that point when I actually submitted my feed.
Yeah, there wasn't, that's not a lot, though, when you think about it at that time, because you was 6 months 7 months into podcasting, and there was only 2,000 shows. That wasn't a lot, and it really didn't explode. And as you mentioned earlier, there was the 3 geocaching shows that came out within a month, and that was because they all came out right after iTunes. And after iTunes, that was when the explosion of podcasts came.
Yeah. Well, and that was the other thing is when iTunes came out with their directory, so it was one directory that you could use. That really was a big deal. They had the ease of subscription, that nice model where you could go and find the podcast. That's when I really started to get into it, and I started downloading a whole bunch more shows. Kind of lost track of some of the older, longer form content because a 2-hour radio show that repeats itself just doesn't have the same appeal in a podcast as something that's a little bit more robust.
Exactly. Yeah, getting the shorter content, 20 minutes, 30 minutes that you can consume on a drive, on a commute, really made a huge difference.
Yeah, now we have, I keep thinking that we've actually lost a lot of the podcasts, but I was looking at the list today of the shows that we still actually have running on geocaching, and I think the list might actually have grown a little bit from last year. And I did update the list on the website, and of course I'll put this in the show notes too. But what I'm going to do is just read through some of the geocaching shows that are broadcast in English or distributed in English, because there are some others that I don't understand because they're German and Spanish. I don't speak either one. But there's the Cacher's Corner out of New Brunswick, Canada. There's Caching in the Northwest, which I almost pulled you off the list because it's been about a year now.
It has been. You should have pulled me off the list, and then I'll come back in a rebirth, and it'll be just that much better.
Well, remember, iTunes' definition of what's a show that stays in the directory is, does the feed still work? As long as the feed is still active and a file downloads, they consider it a live show.
Yep. Yeah, and that's why a lot of those old shows still show up in the directory, even though they haven't had a show out in like 5, 6 years.
Yes.
Another one is the Chicago Geocacher podcast. A lot of fun, but not quite safe for work. Then, of course, the Geocaching podcast, the Geo Snippets reboot show that's actually recording probably about right now as we record this one. There's GeoTalk. That's another long-term geocaching show out of Australia. There's a newer Hiker James geocaching talk show that records through Blog Talk Radio, so that's another one of those call-in talk show kind of things. The podcast show out of the UK, Podcaster, of course, who's at this point I think the oldest of the currently running shows. Twin Cities,
running, sure.
Yeah. Twin Cities Geocaching podcast kind of sporadically puts out some shows, and they were another one of those early shows. And the last of the ones that I know about right now is the UK Geocaching podcast. So I think that that's the entire list of the shows, aside from ours, that's currently running. If you do know of another show, I'd love to hear about it, because we obviously can't catch everything as hard as I tried searching. Not everyone necessarily shows up in the Google searches or searches on iTunes.
What about the Granite State Geocaching podcast?
They went away a while ago.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah, so did Centennial State.
Centennial State, that's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, they haven't had a show since, I want to say, March. Okay. I'd have to go back and check.
I know they were becoming inconsistent there at the end. So.
Yeah, and we've lost some of the other ones. One of the ones that I really enjoyed was the main podcast, because that was a couple of women, and one of the few shows that we had in the geocaching community that was based on the women's perspective. So that I really did enjoy. And that's one of the things that I kind of miss, is that there don't seem to be as many women in podcasting as you'd kind of expect.
12%. 12% of podcasters are women. That's it.
Wow.
Yeah, about 12.5. So we looked through all the shows that are hosting with us, and they're male or female hosts, and it was 12.5%. And there's been a couple of surveys that have been done, and there's been 13%, 14% in those surveys. Blogging is 52% female. So there's a big discrepancy between female bloggers and female podcasters. It's like 3,600 to 1 female bloggers for every female podcaster. So I always tell people, if you're a blogger and you're a female and you want to stand out from the other female bloggers, podcast.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd really love to get some more female voices in on the geocaching world. So if you are a woman and want to get started, it's not that tough. And there are some actual worries, don't get me wrong, some actual concerns that a lot of women have had. And I do remember, especially early on in podcasting, there were some women who really were getting harassed. But for the most part, I haven't heard any problems from any of the geocaching women who have done shows. I think that we have a little bit smaller and friendlier community.
Yeah, and if you're a woman, be smart. Don't give out your real name, and don't give out your home address.
Yes, definitely.
It's just like anything else on the web. You want to have some protections, especially if you're a woman. You don't want to be giving out all your personal information. But it's very safe. I mean, there's a lot of women that do podcasts, not percentage-wise, but there's still a lot of podcasters, and 12% of 200,000 of podcasts is still a good number. Mm-hmm. About 20,000, 24,000 women out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, you've actually done, Rob, a lot of work with helping get people started, as I recall, especially with some of the new tools like podcasting on an iPhone even.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give someone an idea of what you need now to actually get into podcasting?
Really, all you need now is an iPhone. I mean, and you can podcast with an iPhone. There's a great app out there called BossJock, and the BossJock app, you can record right on it, and you can export right from the app as an MP3 file. It's the only app that lets you export as MP3. And you can export right as an MP3 file, and you can upload it, if you have a Libsyn account, right to your QuickCast folder on Libsyn and your FTP. And you can have it go live on your feed and never even have to log into your Libsyn account. Just do everything from the iPhone. It goes live, goes on your feed. If you have your feed connected, if you have your account connected to your Blogger page or your WordPress page, you can even put the post up on Blogger or WordPress for you. So you just type in the description and the title in the ID3 tags, you upload it, and it does the post for you, and you're done. And if you have a smartphone app, it'll also publish to your smartphone app. So it's really not, it's so easy to podcast now. Not everybody's good about doing a podcast from an iPhone, and you may need other things. But for those that are out, especially in your niche, I can understand why someone may want to get to a certain geolocation and say, I am at this location right now, and and here's what I see around me, to kind of do a sightseeing tour at a specific location.
Yeah, and there were some shows out there. There was actually a video show, I want to say out of Texas, where they actually went and found caches with people, which raised a few questions because you're kind of giving away the secret of the location, the containers. But yeah, it was a show that got started and quickly seemed to have faded off as well. But yeah, it's not tough, and some of those audio tour kind of things are pretty interesting. And I can definitely see that being a great way to get started. But most people still do sit down in front of the computer and fire up something like GarageBand to get started.
And that is the way I do my other show. I mean, today on iOS, I use a Yeti mic, a USB mic, and get it from B&H Photo for $100. It plugs into my MacBook, and I record right into GarageBand, and that's my setup for my Today on iOS podcast, and that's my more popular one. And the Yeti mic's what I'm talking on right now. It's this big mic here, but it's you don't need to spend a lot of money. I always tell people, if you spend over $150 on a mic, you spent too much. By the time people downcode it and they listen in earbuds, they can tell the difference between a $100 mic and a $1,000 mic. That just 99.99% of the people just aren't going to say, "Oh, but your mid-range was off just a little bit." They're just not going to notice it. So I say, you don't have to spend a lot of money to sound good podcasting. You spend a little bit, but you don't have to spend a lot.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say how true that is and how easy it's become. When I first started podcasting, it took me a couple of months to get the gear together, to figure out how to upload a file, to encode it just right, put all the tags on it, and now, you can do it from an iPhone app. It's just not fair.
Yeah, and when I got started, we were working with things like the titanium MacBook Pro, or not MacBook, PowerBook Pro, and I want to say the one that I had was at the time like the fastest one, which was only like a 433 megahertz machine, and you could record on it. But if you did, the fans would spin up so loud that you got this buzzing sound in the microphone, even if it was like over on the other part of the room.
And to encode out an MP3 file, the recording, to export to GarageBand on that original titanium PowerBook, because I had one too, it took longer than the show was. So if the show was 30 minutes, it took like 2 hours or an hour and a half from the time you started to export it out of GarageBand to the time it was actually a finished MP3 file that you could upload. So it was brutal. So I remember I was so happy when I upgraded my machine to a more powerful machine, and it actually only took like 20 minutes to export an hour podcast.
See, in that Michigan Cycling podcast, for probably the first half year, we had no computers involved in the actual recording of the show, because it's just get the recorder out. We had the Marantz recorder, we had a mixer, sit down with a microphone, and there's no computers around, so there's no other noises. And now you can do everything from the iPhone. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I have a Marantz, but when I go out now to do a mobile recording, I take this with me, and I'll take a small mic that I plug in to the bottom of it, a $29 mic that does a really good job, and it just plugs in the bottom of the iPhone. The iRig MicCast mic.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. What are you using to record from the iPhone?
Yeah,
nice.
Matter of fact, here, I'll grab it and I'll show.
Yeah, and one of the things that is interesting, there are more options if you're on an iPad. So that is another option that you might want to look into if you're actually going to look to do it. And I've got a couple of the other options, but overall, I wouldn't think that you really want to go that route, because it does make it much less convenient to actually carry around, to set it up. You know, it's going to give you better options. Like some people I know are actually plugging in little external mixers so they can have multiple microphones and multiple guests on the show.
Yeah, I've seen that.
You know, if that's what you're doing, then that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, my little mixer I've plugged into the iPad just to test it out. Now, I do have to have a powered USB hub in between, but it works just fine.
Yeah.
Now, this is the one I use here. You can see how the size of it's pretty small. And I carry it around in an old can of King Dog Energy Mints that I had cut out, and I put the mic goes right in there in the notch, and this goes in one pocket and the iPhone in the other, and when I'm ready to record, I just pull this out, plug in the mic, and I can do an interview with somebody just like this, and it sounds really good.
Yeah, so it's nice and small. It's it's just a tiny little cube, kind of about the size of the Square Reader for anyone who's familiar with those things.
It's about exactly that same size as the Square Reader here, and again, just fits nice in the can. You get the can I like, the King Dog Energy Mints, which is a podcaster's you need to have that. So these are nice caffeinated mints, and it doesn't take you long to go through that, and then you have a case for your microphone.
Excellent. Now, before we actually wrap this up, for anyone who is looking to get started in podcasting, is there a show that you think that they might want to listen to?
But go back and listen to some old Podcast 411 episodes and current ones, and you'll hear what those podcasters are doing. The most recent one is Ken Ray from macOS Ken. The episode before that was Rich Eisen from the NFL Network. So you can hear what their shows are about, what they got into podcasting, and then go back to the early ones if you really want to get nostalgic, and you can hear what some of those podcasters are doing, why they got into podcasting, and that'll definitely get you fired up to do it. And then listen to the feed with Libsyn, which is a really good one. We have a blog. If you go to blog.libsyn.com, we have a lot of interesting articles in there about podcasting. So we really try to help people out on podcasting. And then my other site, which is podcast411.com, will teach you how to podcasting. There's a nice tutorial in there, step-by-step how to podcast. There's no advertisements on the site, so go there. I'm not making anything from you going there. And it shows you how to do it. And then if you want to do an interview show where you're interviewing people over Skype, I've got a nice setup. If you go to podcast411.com/mixer.pdf, that will show you how my Skype setups, how I've been doing Skype interviews for the last 8.5 years. And I think that's the best way to record Skype. You do it off the computer. I do it on my Marantz recorder. And you do everything off on a mixer, and it just sounds great when you do it that way. So again, podcast411.com/mixer.pdf.
Awesome. Now, you've already mentioned all of those great URLs and stuff, and we'll have those in the show notes. And we really appreciate you coming on and joining us tonight to talk a little bit about the history and how people can get into podcasting.
Okay. Oh, and if you want to start podcasting, get a Libsyn account, use promo code podcast411. And it'll give you free hosting for the rest of the month you're in and the following month. So you get the rest of the current month plus all the following month, and you don't pay until the beginning of the month after that. So podcast 411 for a promo code, and that'll get you on a Libsyn account for free to try it out. And if you don't like it, you stay. If you don't, you can cancel.
Nice. I like that. Okay. So next week, Rob, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me on.
Now, next week, we are fixating on getting good coordinates. Do you see how I did that, Daryl?
I did.
The week after that is a randomized show. So send us any comments, questions, insurrections you may have for these upcoming shows. And Daryl, where can they send us all of their burning questions?
Well, of course, you can check the Cachemaniacs website at cachemaniacs.com for more on the GeoGearHeads, including show notes for this and all of our episodes. We love hearing from our listeners, so leave us feedback by calling 206-350-3647, by emailing geogearheads@cachemaniacs.com, or through social media. We thank CacheAdvance.com for their support of this episode. Your support helps keep the Cachemaniacs shows coming. Please consider making a PayPal donation through the link on our website to support the Cachemaniacs shows. GeoGearHeads is produced by Chris Sufnauer and Daryl Wanberg. This show is copyright 2013 by Daryl Wanberg. All rights reserved.